I didn't know where I was running to, only that I had to keep moving. The rain felt like it was trying to wash me away, just like the rest of the world had. When I stumbled into that club, I was just dirt on their floor, something to be mocked, something to be thrown out with the trash. Then Cassian appeared. He looked at me with eyes cold enough to freeze the rain. He told me to sit, and I thought it was a judgment. But the moment the light hit my skin, the moment he saw the scar I'd been hiding, the air in the room changed. He didn't see a beggar anymore. He saw a ghost from his past. When I showed him the ring, the wall between us shattered. He didn't offer pity. He offered war. And for the first time in years, looking into the eyes of a monster, I felt safe. That first moment, the shock of it, the feeling of the rain still dripping off my cheap nurse's jacket and soaking into the plush velvet carpet of the black vault. It's something I can still taste, like copper and cold fear, mixed with the stale, expensive perfume of wealth and power. I'd been running for maybe 10 minutes, my lungs burning in my chest, a desperate, searing pain that felt like I was tearing myself apart from the inside, not knowing the two guys chasing me were anything more than just bad news looking for trouble. And I burst through those massive dark oak doors like a wet, terrified stray dog seeking shelter from a hurricane. The noise hit me first, a thick, humming wall of low-frequency music and expensive, careless laughter that carried no genuine joy. The interior was a study in lethal, understated luxury, designed to feel impenetrable and silent, every surface polished to a dangerous sheen. Deep shadows clung to the corners, complementing the rich mahogany and leather banquettes, and every single person in the room looked like they had a secret worth killing for carrying themselves with the casual arrogance of people who held power, like it was air, like it was their birthright. I just collapsed right inside the entrance, panting, trying to catch my breath, and I remember thinking, Arya, you've done it now. You've run straight into the kind of trouble even your nightmares would avoid, the kind of money that doesn't forgive small mistakes or messy intrusions. I was a complete mess, truly. My thin hospital-issue scrubs were torn, where I'd snagged them on a fence. My face was scraped raw from a desperate fall on the slick concrete, and I could feel a warm, sticky trickle of blood running down my neck, hidden mostly by my matted hair, but visible enough that it was starting to stain the collar of my jacket, a horrifying flag of my distress. There I was, disrupting all that polished silence, this little piece of inconvenient chaos that didn't belong, a visible, tangible symbol of the world they worked so hard to keep outside their gilded walls, and I felt my utter lack of consequence. Before anyone could even move, before the men inside could process the intrusion, the two thugs who had been chasing me, they looked like overgrown children in cheap tracksuits, all muscle and no sense, skidded to a halt, right in the doorway, their faces contorted in that mix of anger and confusion when their prey escapes unexpectedly. They must have realized instantly where they were seeing the size and stillness of the bouncer, because their street bravado just evaporated, replaced by a sudden sickening cowardice that made them look truly pathetic. They looked small and scared, backing away quickly before the bouncer, who was the size of a small truck and moved with surprising contained grace, even had to lift a finger to escort them out. That was when the laughter started, and it wasn't kind shared laughter, the sound of people enjoying themselves. It was the kind of cold, cruel laughter that comes from people who know they are utterly untouchable, laughing at something they perceive as utterly beneath them, a public ritual of dismissal that sliced through my last thread of composure. A group of men dressed in suits that probably cost more than my annual rent, and carrying a heavy air of self-importance, just erupted. One of them, a big guy with a shaved head and a diamond stud the size of a pea in his ear, pointed directly at me, still huddled on the floor, and spat out the words laced with profound boredom. This girl's probably some drama queen begging for trouble. Just some little piece of theater trying to get a free drink, or maybe a quick score, a pathetic attempt at relevance. And then another one chimed in louder this time, his voice cutting through the heavy music that was trying to reassert itself. Look at her, Marco. She's bleeding on the good carpet. Get security to toss her out and send her a dry cleaning bill for the trouble she's causing. The sheer entitlement of some people. I just curled up tighter, pulling my knees to my chest, making myself as small as possible, trying desperately to become invisible, praying they would forget I was even there, hoping the shadows would finally consume me. I couldn't even speak. The crushing shame and the sheer physical exhaustion were just too overwhelming, mixing with the adrenaline rush that had propelled me there in the first place. I kept wishing the expensive floor would open up and swallow me whole, taking the embarrassment and the paralyzing fear with it, just so I wouldn't have to face another second of their contempt, their effortless cruelty. It was in that pregnant pause, just as the huge bouncer was finally starting to lumber toward me, his face impassive but his intent clear and ominous, that the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift entirely, the way the air pressure drops right before a major storm hits with full force. It was an instant absolute silence that wasn't created, but commanded by a force greater than anyone present. The laughter cut off mid-gasp, mid-syllable, and every single head in the room swiveled, every gaze fixed on a doorway near the private lounge at the back. I didn't need anyone to tell me who it was or even point in his direction. The sheer weight of the man's presence, the way the light seemed to dim when he moved into the room, was enough to announce him freezing time itself. He moved with a kind of predatory stillness, a total absence of wasted motion, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been molded directly onto his body, emphasizing his formidable physical presence. Cassian Rourke. I didn't know his name then, only his reputation. The kind of quiet, terrifying rumor that sticks to the underside of the city like tar, the undisputed ruler of this silent domain, and the air around him felt intensely dangerous. He didn't look at me right away. He looked only at the carpet, at the small, growing wet patch my coat was making an offense to his meticulous order. And then his eyes slowly tracked up past the frozen, laughing men, past the stunned bouncer, until they finally landed on me huddled in the corner. His eyes were the color of ice in the deepest shadow, and the coldness there was absolute, not angry or emotional, just utterly devoid of warmth or hesitation, like looking into the heart of a glacier that had never known the sun. He took 2 slow steps, closing the distance, and then his voice, a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the silence, sliced the air with the precision of a scalpel, demanding immediate, absolute compliance. Sit. It wasn't a question that invited dialogue, it wasn't a suggestion, and it wasn't even a demand that could be refused. It was an instruction delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel that signaled the end of all discussion and the beginning of a new, terrifying reality. I think I blinked 3 times, maybe 4, trying to process the sound, the absolute authority woven into that single syllable, the sheer audacity of this man who saw me as nothing but an object to be placed where he dictated a piece of furniture. I opened my mouth, a pathetic little stammer escaping something thin and weak, like I can leave. I'm truly sorry for the intrusion. I won't cause any more trouble. I started to try and unfold my legs, scramble up, and make a hasty retreat, but he just stepped closer, and I could feel the cold, magnetic heat radiating off him, the sheer power of his intensely focused attention, a laser beam fixed on my small form. His jaw tightened just perceptibly, a subtle movement that suggested immense, barely contained force, and the ice in his eyes seemed to solidify into obsidian. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The power was in the control and the silence. He just repeated the instruction, his voice dropping another octave dangerously low, a primal sound of command that vibrated in my bones. I said, "Sit." I sat instantly, the reflex of survival overriding everything else. I dropped back down, not onto the floor where I had been, but into the nearest leather armchair, my limbs suddenly useless, stripped of any will to resist. The whole bar, dozens of people who were used to seeing men, killed over a misplaced glance, were staring at me like I was cheap chaos, the stain on their impeccable night, waiting to see how this incredibly powerful, intensely cold man was going to dispose of the pathetic mess I was. It was a humiliating, awful moment, a moment where my existence felt reduced to nothing, and I truly believed that the very next thing I heard would be my death sentence delivered without a hint of emotion or regret, just pure business. But then the strangest thing happened, something that derailed the entire predictable trajectory of the evening, shifting the ground beneath our feet. Cassian didn't look at me. He looked away toward the bar and gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. A bartender immediately killed the music that was trying to creep back in, and the lighting, which had been set to a moody dark gold intended to flatter expensive whiskey and jewelry, suddenly shifted. The spotlight from the bar's overhead fixture, a harsh, unintended beam of white, unsparing light, caught me right in the face, making me squint. And it also caught the side of my neck, perfectly illuminating the hidden truth. I instinctively lifted my hand, trying to block the glare, and that was when Cassian Rourke, the man who had ordered me to sit, who had terrified me more than the thugs chasing me, absolutely froze his stillness, more unnerving than any movement a statue struck by lightning. I watched the change happen in his face, and it was terrifying, because it wasn't fear, it wasn't indecision, it was something much darker and more visceral, a flash of pure remembered horror and white-hot grief. The coldness didn't melt. It shattered completely, revealing a deep tremor, a raw, wounded volcanic emotion that seemed to threaten the very foundations of his control, shaking the very air around us. His eyes fixed entirely on the small, jagged, electrically burned dagger symbol on the side of my neck, the one I usually kept hidden meticulously with my hair, the one I hadn't even realized was exposed by the tear in my cheap coat, turned from ice to a burning, terrible, wounded realization. He knew that mark, and he knew exactly what it meant, the sickening signature of a shared trauma. I didn't have to hear his face to know he'd recognized it. I could just feel the collective frozen shock of the room, the absolute silence and the way the very air stopped moving around us, thick and heavy with history. It was a specific sickening symbol, the sign of Ivan Markov, the Russian kingpin, the man who collects victim marks, who treats torture as an art form, who had turned suffering into his personal emblem, and who was also, I learned in the deep pit of my stomach, the man who had murdered Cassian's beloved sister years ago, a loss that had shaped Rourke into the terrifying, merciless figure he was today. That ugly mark, that brand that spoke of unspeakable cruelty and dehumanizing imprisonment, had suddenly transformed me in his eyes from dirt on the floor to a living, breathing accusation, a ghost from his deepest, most unforgivable trauma, walking into his sanctuary. Cassian's voice, when it finally came, was no longer a gravelly order of the boss. It was low trembling, with an intense internal effort to control something massive and destructive inside him, something that wanted to rage against the injustice of the past. He took one step closer, his eyes still locked on the scar, tracing its outline with a horrifying familiarity. And he didn't ask about the chasers or the club or my clothes or the money. He asked the only question that mattered to him, the only key to the darkness. Who hurt you? I couldn't answer. I just shook my head slightly, fresh tears welling up, and they weren't tears of fear anymore. They were tears of relived agony, the deep old pain suddenly fresh and stinging, overwhelming my ability to speak. I tried to whisper, "I can't speak the name, I can't," but no sound came out, just a choked gasp. The refusal, that inability to speak the name that meant everything to him, infuriated him, driving him past the brink of his control, and he slammed his open hand down onto the beautiful polished walnut table next to him with the force of a thunderclap. The sound was deafening, a sharp, violent crack that echoed in the deathly silent room, making the crystal glasses on the bar ring like a distant mournful chime, a sound of profound rage. "You're not leaving until you tell me who did that to you," he growled, the tremor now a full-blown vibration in his chest, a clear signal that he was barely holding on to his composure. I realized then that my life wasn't about to end. It was about to change irrevocably, because I had stumbled into the center of a blood feud I couldn't escape even if I wanted to, bound to him by a shared, horrifying enemy. And that shared history was my unlikely shield. I know this is a heavy moment, this feeling of having everything shift under your feet, the sudden overwhelming sensation of being seen for the deepest, darkest secret you carry. And you might be thinking, "Okay, Arya, why didn't you just run right then? Why didn't you seize the chance to escape this madman?" But the truth is, I couldn't. I was trapped not by the door or the bouncer, but by the weight of that recognition in his eyes, the undeniable raw connection that had just been formed between us, by a symbol of pain. He saw the truth in me, the survivor, the victim, the ghost, even when I was too scared to speak it, and that's a powerful thing, a terrible kind of safety. Look, if this story is resonating with you, if you've ever felt overlooked, or like your quiet pain was entirely invisible to the world, I just want to take a quick, quiet second here for a soft, genuine moment of connection. Could you maybe open your phone like this video and leave a comment below? Tell me what part of the country you're watching from, or just say hello and share a thought. And please hit that subscribe button. It's what allows me to keep sharing these difficult, intensely human stories about finding strength when you're cornered, and I promise we're just getting started on this journey through the darkness and into the healing. Thank you. Now back to that awful echoing silence in the club and the terrifying promise Cassian had just made. The immediate aftermath of Cassian's outburst was awful, a concentrated dose of suspicion and fear that replaced the previous contempt, a political minefield I had unknowingly stepped into. I wasn't just not leaving, I was being detained right there in the velvet cage of the Black Vault, an instant prisoner of war. The man who had laughed at me. Marco suddenly looked pale and intensely uncomfortable, and he and the others were quickly dismissed with a sharp glance from Cassian's closest confidant, a heavy-set loyal man, whose name I learned was Dante. They scattered, clearly terrified of the boss's volcanic temper. But the trouble didn't end there. It just intensified because the moment Cassian moved me into a private back room, not kindly but with a controlling firmness, holding my elbow like a vice, treating me like a volatile asset, he couldn't afford to let loose. The whispers started. In that world, an unexpected visitor, especially one branded by a rival kingpin, could only mean one thing: a trap. A Trojan horse sent by Ivan Markov to destabilize Cassian Rourke, to lure him into a vulnerable emotional state by exploiting his past grief. The word spread through the organization like wildfire. A girl with Markov's mark appeared in the vault. She's Rourke's problem now, and she smells like a setup, a very expensive one. I could practically feel the suspicion hanging in the air, a thick, poisonous fog of paranoia and mistrust, turning every gesture I made into a potential hidden signal. Cassian's men, these stone-faced, intimidating shadows, kept glancing at me, their faces hardening with mistrust, convinced I was a sophisticated piece of bait, a calculated distraction. I was subjected to the most dehumanizing search, not rough, thankfully, but terrifyingly thorough, stripping me of every personal item, checking for wires, listening devices, tracking chips, anything that could possibly tie me to an intelligence operation. They were looking for the flaw, the seam in the facade. I was dirty, tired, and bleeding, and they treated me like garbage, a piece of volatile biological waste they had to handle with tongs, not daring to get too close, terrified of contagion. The interrogation began almost immediately, less of a professional questioning designed to find the truth, and more of a brutal display of the organization's paranoia, a continuous psychological dismantling. They had me sit across a long antique table in a room filled with nothing but deep shadows and the unsettling stillness of men waiting for a trap to spring, waiting for me to falter and reveal the wire. They weren't yelling, which was actually worse. They were just cold, clinical, and entirely dismissive of my humanity, looking at my quiet distress as nothing more than a carefully crafted performance designed to elicit sympathy. The worst of it came 2 days later, after hours of relentless circular questioning that left me hollowed out when a woman was brought in, one of the organization's high-ranking figures, a sophisticated and frightening woman named Valentina, who specialized in crisis management and clearly character assassination. She swept into the room in a perfectly tailored silk blouse, her dark hair pulled back severely, and her gaze was a razor-sharp critique that seemed to assess my flaws and deficiencies instantly and judge them lacking. She didn't even look at me. She addressed Cassian, who was standing by the window, his back to us, a statue carved from granite, silently absorbing the pressure of her criticism. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly contemptuous, designed to cut right through the bone of his judgment. "Cassian, darling," she sneered, dragging the word out like a piece of spoiled meat, an insinuation of distaste for his entire handling of the situation. "Are you truly shaking with indecision and pausing operations because of a pathetic little girl who couldn't even manage to run fast enough to escape a couple of low-level street thugs? You're allowing a piece of human collateral, someone clearly trying to play the victim for attention and sympathy, to disrupt everything we've built, everything your family died for. It's an insult to their memory." She didn't wait for an answer, turning her icy blue eyes on me for the first time, a look of profound disgust and intellectual dismissal, crossing her features as if I were a particularly poor piece of art. "Honestly, Rourke, this girl is dead weight." She's a liability, a loose end that will inevitably snag us in Markov's net, and frankly, she smells like trouble that's already festering and will spread. We should just dispose of her quietly and cleanly, and send Markov a message that his childish attempts at psychological warfare and sentimentality are not working on the Rourke family. End this before it starts. I just sat there, my hands folded tightly in my lap, rubbing the rough fabric of the borrowed t-shirt they'd given me, trying to keep my breathing even. Trying not to react, knowing any emotional break would instantly confirm her damning judgment. I met her gaze, held it without flinching, and when she finally looked away, annoyed by my silent, unmoving defiance, I felt a flicker of my own quiet inner steel. But their words still cut deep, making me feel small, disposable, and utterly alone. And I knew they were actively deciding how and where to dump my body before I could contaminate them further. A logistical problem, nothing more. The moment of decision arrived, ushered in by the grim faces, the pervasive smell of expensive cigar smoke, and the repeated threat of my disposal. And I knew I had to speak, not to beg for my life, but to offer the kind of undeniable truth that only a genuine victim could possess, a truth that would serve them better than my silence. My voice, when it finally emerged, was a strained, painful whisper, still raw from days of fear and sleeplessness, but it held the steady, cold weight of absolute authenticity, devoid of tears. I'm not a spy. I finally managed, my eyes fixed on the tabletop, trying to find strength in the wood grain, connecting myself to something solid in the shifting reality of the room. I'm a survivor. I lifted my head, then looked straight at Cassian, whose dark eyes were watching me with an unnerving, calculating intensity, trying to find the lie, the single flaw in my story. You think Markov sent me as a trap, but Markov doesn't send people. He collects them, toys with them until they are hollow shells. And once he's done, he discards them like trash, like a broken toy he no longer enjoys. I was discarded 3 years ago, my file closed, presumed dead, by everyone who mattered, including my own family. I started describing the place, the terrifying underground facility, where the dagger mark was earned, in the kind of sickening, precise, hyper-realistic detail that immediately silenced the last of the room's doubt, freezing the cynics in their chairs, forcing them to confront the horror. I talked about the smell of ozone and damp concrete mixed with old blood, the eerie sound of the forced ventilation unit that never stopped humming its relentless tune, the exact pattern of the peeling paint on the main door, the things you only notice when you've stared at them for months, counting every crack like a lifeline marking the passage of time in a living hell. I didn't use vague language. I talked about the specific height of the iron manacles on the wall, the brand of cheap, sickly sweet antiseptic they used to clean the wounds after sessions, and the precise, lazy rhythm of the guards' shifts. Every detail was a cold, hard stone of proof, a stone thrown into the water of their disbelief, and the ripple effect of grim realization was visible on their faces, even Valentina's cold facade cracking momentarily under the weight of the truth. Then I delivered the real blow, the one that hit Cassian where he lived, shattering the protective shell he had built around his grief and his carefully guarded memories. I took a shaky breath, the memory of that last awful day still sharp enough to cut me, and I whispered the name of my brother, Elias Lane. You think I'm working for Markov, but I was looking for him, for Elias. The room went even quieter, if that was possible, the kind of absolute silence that suggests a massive, shared, unhealed loss hanging heavy in the air. I could see the sudden, desperate, painful hope flare in Cassian's eyes, followed instantly by the cold, defensive shield of cynicism, a man unwilling to be fooled again, too afraid to hope. Elias Lane, Cassian's closest friend, his former right-hand man, presumed dead for 3 agonizing years, a tragedy that had nearly broken the formidable Mafia boss, leaving a permanent shadow over his rule. He's alive, I insisted, pushing the words past the lump in my throat, forcing myself to look him directly in the eye, willing him to believe. I know he is. Markov didn't kill him. He kept him for leverage, for something I don't understand, but he is still there, still fighting, still trying to get free. I reached into the borrowed t-shirt, pulled a small, grimy, perfectly preserved object from where I had carefully sewn it into the hem, a habit you learn in places like Markov's prison, keeping the few precious things you have literally stitched into your skin a tiny insurance policy against madness. I laid it on the table, pushing it slowly toward Cassian. It was a fragment small and jagged of a broken Mafia ring, not just any ring, but the custom-made, uniquely fractured piece of the Rourke family crest that Elias had worn every single day, a symbolic half of his life. "He got this to me," I said, my voice finally cracking, betraying the emotion I was fighting so hard to suppress the pain of the memory washing over me. He smuggled it out, broke it off himself with impossible strength, and somehow managed to pass it to another prisoner who was being released with instructions to find me to tell me he was still alive and fighting. The sheer unlikeliness of the relic, the undeniable authenticity of the crest, and the specific way it had been broken, a personal signature only Elias and Cassian would recognize, a testament to their bond, hit the Mafia boss like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole his breath. He didn't move for a long time, just stared at the sliver of metal, his chest rising and falling slowly. And I watched the last bit of color drain from his face, leaving him looking hollowed out, utterly still, and finally undeniably convinced by the weight of the undeniable evidence. The reaction, once the initial shock wore off and the last seeds of doubt were extinguished, was not gratitude or acceptance of me as a warrior, but a new, deeper layer of protective control, and it was crushing to my spirit, another form of dismissal. Cassian immediately had his men scramble to verify the location of the prison. I described, confirming that the impossible details I'd offered were chillingly accurate, and that Elias was indeed likely still alive and imprisoned. My proof was solid, my history undeniable, but that didn't make me an ally in their eyes. It only made me valuable and dangerously vulnerable, a resource to be protected and kept safe, a piece of necessary intelligence. So when I insisted with a sudden, desperate surge of confidence that I had to go with them on the rescue mission, that I knew the tunnels, I knew the guards' habits, I knew how to navigate the psychological minefield of that dreadful place, Cassian shut me down with a swift, brutal finality that felt like a slap across the face, a painful dismissal of my capabilities. His voice turned to absolute ice, the tone he reserved for making executive decisions that no one dared to question, the voice of the unquestioned authority. "No," he stated, pushing off the wall, walking toward me slowly, his immense shadow falling over my small form, like a blanket of lead, emphasizing the size difference and my perceived helplessness. "You're fragile, Arya. You've just described 3 years of hellish torture, of barely holding on to your mind. You'll only get yourself killed, and worse, you'll compromise the mission by forcing us to babysit you under fire. You are too emotional, too volatile, and too much of a risk for something this delicate and high stakes. Your value is here alive." His men, who had just moments before been convinced I was a spy, now just nodded grimly in agreement, their mistrust morphing into a pitying dismissal that stung worse than their hatred. One of them, the heavy-set Dante, added a crushing word to the argument, nodding in Cassian's direction as if he was providing a service to his boss. "Boss is absolutely right, Arya. You'd be dead weight in a firefight. We don't need an emotional breakdown when we're trying to extract Elias and make it out alive. You've done your part by giving us the location. We'll take it from here, stick to the plan, and you'll be safe in the compound." I opened my mouth to argue, to scream that I wasn't weak, that the quiet, contained way I survived didn't mean I was fragile, but Cassian just lifted his hand, a small, authoritative gesture cutting off my protest, before it even began, rendering my words useless, a soundless plea in a room full of steel. He didn't physically threaten me. He just made a subtle gesture toward a door tucked away in the corner of the room, a door that led to a luxurious but entirely lockable VIP suite designed for temporary secure housing. "You will stay here," he commanded, his eyes boring into mine, daring me to disobey, making it clear this was not up for discussion, not a negotiation. "You'll be comfortable, you'll be safe, and you'll wait until we bring your brother home." And that was it. I was escorted not roughly, but with a controlling firmness into the room, which felt less like a sanctuary, and more like a gilded cage, and the heavy electronic lock clicked shut behind me with a sound that echoed the finality of their judgment and my perpetual fate as the overlooked woman. I sank onto the plush, silk-covered bed, staring at the closed door, and the tears came then, hot and quiet, the ones I hadn't dared to shed during the interrogation, the ones reserved for pure personal failure and the sting of being perpetually misunderstood. It wasn't just the fear, it was the sting of being underestimated again, of having my quiet strength dismissed as fragility, just like every boss, every colleague, every person of influence had done my whole life. 3 years of enduring Markov, 3 years of fighting for every breath, and in the end I was still just the pathetic little girl, locked away for being dead weight, judged by the chaos of my past, not the steel of my present. But Markov's prison, and the desperate years of hiding and surviving afterward, teaches you things you know. It teaches you to be quiet, to be patient, to endure the unendurable, and above all, it teaches you to observe the smallest, most insignificant details, because your life often depends on recognizing a tiny flaw in the system. I spent maybe an hour locked in that beautiful room, listening to the silence, letting the tears dry on my face, and then I got up, my focus sharpening with a sudden cold, diamond-hard resolve that felt entirely new. I wasn't going to sit there and cry while my brother's fate was decided by men who saw me as nothing more than a glass figurine. Elias, before he was taken, had been obsessed with electronics and lock mechanisms. It was his quiet hobby, a strange interest for a man in that line of work, and he'd taught me a few things mostly as a joke, little tricks for getting into locked storage cabinets and outdated alarm systems. He used to say, "Always understand the mechanism, Arya. Knowledge is the key that doesn't rust. Never trust a simple spring." I pulled a simple metal hairpin from my hair, one I'd managed to keep hidden in the cuff of my scrubs for 3 years, a habit born of necessity and paranoia, and I went to work on the electronic lock. I was applying the strange, fiddly skills Elias had forced into my head, remembering his specific instructions about short-circuiting a low-voltage security feed by hitting a specific sensor junction. It took time, painful, agonizing minutes of quiet clicks and adjustments, feeling like every second was a betrayal of the clock. But finally, with a soft, almost inaudible snick that sounded like the sweetest victory, the electronic latch short-circuited, and the heavy door clicked open. Freedom earned with a piece of metal and a memory, a silent defiance of Cassian's command. I didn't run. I moved slowly, silently, like a ghost, easing myself into the sprawling, well-guarded hallways of the Rourke compound, keeping to the shadows and the blind spots Elias had once identified as a game. My plan wasn't to flee. It was to prove my worth, to stop them from making a fatal, arrogant mistake based on their own internal biases and hubris. I knew that in this world, trust was a luxury no one could afford, and the fact that I walked in with Markov's mark meant their suspicion was still simmering beneath the surface even after my disclosures. I also knew that Markov was too meticulous, too cruel, too much of a master strategist to not have a contingency plan built into the Rourke organization itself, a sleeper agent waiting for the perfect moment. I slipped into an unoccupied office, my heart pounding a steady, nervous rhythm against my ribs, and used the old, battered laptop I found there, leveraging a backdoor access key Elias had shown me years ago, a piece of code he'd written for emergency situations, in case their systems were ever compromised. Within minutes, I was into the internal camera feed, and it was like holding a key to their entire kingdom, seeing every shadow and movement, every unguarded moment. I wasn't looking for Elias. I was looking for the flaw, the subtle, constant pattern of deception that Markov would exploit. And there he was, the inevitable serpent in the garden. Cassian's top lieutenant, a man named Leandro, the one who'd always looked at me with that patronizing air of suspicion, the one who had been so vocal about disposing of me as a liability. I watched him on the muted feed, confirming my worst fears. He was in a quiet, isolated corner of the compound, holding a low, furtive conversation on an encrypted satellite phone, his back pressed tight to the wall, his expression one of cold, smug triumph that made my stomach churn with disgust. He was talking about the mission, about the revised plans to move in on Markov's prison, giving the exact coordinates and the painstakingly planned time of attack, and he was giving them to someone on Markov's side. The whole exchange was sickening, a blatant betrayal not just of Cassian, but of my brother, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the freezing rain outside, a coldness that spoke of pure, calculated evil, the depth of his double dealing. I quickly mirrored the conversation onto the laptop, capturing the audio, the timestamp and the clear image of his face. The whole thing a perfect, irrefutable recording of his treachery, his exact words, a knife in my chest. I didn't think about the danger to myself. I thought only of Elias and the necessity of stopping this mole before he got Cassian killed and ensured my brother's permanent, agonizing fate. I snatched the small phone, its glass screen still warm from the recording, and marched straight toward the main briefing room, the place where all the top brass were gathered, ready to finalize the mission that Leandro was at that very moment selling out. I walked right through the double doors, a small, wet, insignificant figure in borrowed clothes, and the sight of me caused a ripple of stunned silence to break across the tense, smoky room, an instant cessation of conversation, a collective holding of breath. Cassian was standing over a large map of the city, his back to me, and he didn't need to turn around to know who had violated his command. He just seemed to sense my presence, the sheer audacity of my disobedience vibrating in the air like a plucked wire. Before anyone could shout, before anyone could try to stop me or question my unauthorized presence, I took 3 decisive steps into the center of the room, my hand trembling only slightly, and I threw the phone onto the center of the antique mahogany table with a sharp, echoing clack that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. It slid to a stop right in front of Leandro, who was mid-sentence talking about troop movement and whose face instantly went from smug control to utter catastrophic horror and disbelief, his facade melting away. My voice, though quiet, was steady and perfectly clear, amplified by the shock of my presence and the absolute silence of the room. The traitor isn't me. I stated, my eyes fixed on Leandro, who was now scrambling to deny everything, his hands flying up in a useless gesture of innocence and shock, a pathetic display of panic. It's him. The proof is on the screen. Listen. The room went dead silent again, but this was a different kind of silence, a heavy, suffocating shock that paralyzed everyone present, a fear of the truth and the consequences it brought. Cassian finally turned around slowly, deliberately, and he didn't look at Leandro first. He looked at me, taking in the wet hair, the borrowed clothes, the defiant stance. His gaze traced the wet hair on my forehead, the determined set of my jaw, the silent defiance in my posture, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the cold, calculating realization that the girl he had dismissed as fragile had just committed an act of war, and in doing so, had saved his life and his organization by exposing the cancer at its heart. In that profound moment, the way he looked at me, not with fear or anger, or even the protective pity he'd shown before, but with a sudden profound awe and respect, like I had become someone entirely new, a dangerous, necessary element that was the greatest validation I had ever received the moment he finally saw the fire beneath the quiet demeanor. The fallout from that moment was immediate and brutally violent. Leandro was subdued before he could even utter a coherent denial, dragged out of the room with a frightening speed that showed the efficiency of Cassian's men, and the entire mission was instantly postponed, rerouted and redesigned, with me now sitting at the table, consulted and respected as an equal. I was no longer a prisoner, but a trusted, if still unsettling, advisor, brought fully into the inner circle, my insights given weight and gravity. Cassian didn't apologize, because that wasn't his nature, or the nature of his world, but his subsequent actions spoke volumes. He treated my knowledge, my insights into Markov's psychological warfare, with a focused respect that no one had ever shown me before. Yet just as the tension was starting to ease and the new, safer plan was being laid out, Markov struck back with the viciousness of a cornered snake, targeting not the organization's structure, which he knew was now secure, but its heart, Cassian's deep emotional connection to Elias. A courier arrived, delivering a small, perfectly square antique wooden box to the Rourke compound. Cassian opened it, his face already taut with apprehension, and the sight of what was inside caused the blood to drain from his face once more, leaving him looking like a marble statue, horrified and immobile with grief. It was Elias's ring finger, severed, cleanly, carefully preserved in a gruesome clinical manner, placed delicately on a bed of ice in the dark box, and with it a folded note written in Markov's looping, sick handwriting. The message was short, brutal, and aimed directly at Cassian's most vulnerable spot. "Tell your nurse friend I know she's there and she's trying to hide. This is what happens to the ones you try to save, Rourke. This is the cost of sentimentality, a price you should have been prepared to pay. The psychological warfare was relentless and instantly effective, a masterstroke of cruelty that targeted the bond of brotherhood. The underworld began to mock Cassian openly and mercilessly. The whispers didn't stop, but they changed their tune from suspicion to outright derision. Now they were saying Rourke's gone soft, losing pieces of his dead brothers because he's chasing a night shift nurse who can't keep herself safe. The shame and the pressure became a physical presence in the compound, a suffocating blanket of grief and accusation. And the men, who had just days ago respected my information, suddenly looked at me with renewed hostility, their grief and rage seeking an easy, convenient target for their pain. I was the reason. I brought Markov's attention back to Elias. It was a crushing, unbearable weight of guilt, and it all came to a head when one of the younger, more reckless henchmen, his eyes red and his face twisted with genuine, unbridled pain. For Elias walked right up to me as I stood silently by the fireplace, trying to remain invisible, trying to absorb the criticism without shattering. He didn't even yell. He knew a quiet blow would be sharper. He just leaned in, lowered his head slightly, and spat directly at my feet, his contempt absolute. "You're the reason Elias is being tortured." He hissed the words raw with condemnation and personal grief. "You should have stayed buried and kept your mouth shut. Now we are all paying the price for your selfishness. Look at what you've done." That moment, the spittle drying on the floor near my shoes, the sheer open hostility, and the devastating truth of his words, that my actions had indeed worsened Elias's suffering, was my absolute breaking point. I had survived Markov's physical cruelty, the pain and the scars, but this psychological attack, the complete inversion of my intent, crushed me utterly. I was the one who was supposed to save my brother, and instead I had just signed his death warrant and brought shame and danger to Cassian, the only man who had ever trusted me. I was undeniably Cassian's weakness, a liability he didn't need in a world that devoured weakness as quickly as possible. I turned without saying a word, grabbing my threadbare bag, the one remnant of my old life, and walked out of the compound. Cassian saw me go, but I didn't look back, just kept moving through the freezing, relentless rain that had started again, falling like a curtain over the entire city, washing away my last bit of hope and blurring my tears. I was going to disappear, to vanish back into the shadows where I belonged, maybe go back to being an insignificant nurse, maybe find another way to fight Markov alone. But I knew I couldn't stay there infecting Cassian's strength with my own constant peril. My presence was a liability, and I had to remove it before it killed us both. I walked for hours, aimlessly letting the cold and the sheer exhaustion numb the raw, exposed nerves of my grief, allowing my muscles to fail me as my spirit had failed Elias. I eventually ended up at the old deserted cargo docks, the kind of place where the wind howls straight off the freezing water, and the silence is broken only by the creaking of old abandoned ships and the distant cry of gulls. I sat down on a concrete barrier, staring out at the oily black expanse of the bay, the rain coming down in thick sheets, creating a perfect, desolate, monochrome world, when I heard the low, unmistakable growl of a powerful engine and the sudden squeal of expensive tires on wet pavement. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. Cassian Rourke, of course, wouldn't just let me walk away. His nature, his controlling instinct, his refusal to accept loss, wouldn't allow it. He strode out of the car, slamming the door behind him, with a resonant thud that echoed across the desolate docks. He wasn't wearing his impeccable suit. He had on a simple black jacket, wet and clinging to his massive frame, and his hair was plastered to his forehead, giving him a wild, elemental look that was somehow more dangerous than his usual polished control. He didn't approach immediately, just stood there in the pouring rain, looking furious, wounded, and utterly relentless. The man who had lost everything, and was refusing to lose one more thing to the machinations of his enemy. "You don't get to walk away?" He shouted the words, carrying easily over the wind and the rain, not because he was screaming, but because his voice was charged with an intensity that demanded to be heard, a pure distillation of his pain and resolve. I finally turned my head slowly, the rainwater stinging my eyes and mixing with my tears. I didn't get up, just stayed sitting on the cold barrier, feeling the wetness soak through my cheap clothes, accepting the chill. "I am your weakness, Cassian." I fired back, my voice surprisingly steady against the wind, not a shout, but a clean, cold statement of fact. A truth I couldn't deny even if it destroyed me. Markov knows it. Your men know it. I brought shame to your organization, and I made Elias's situation worse, not better. I'm a distraction, a liability, a weakness waiting to be exploited, and I won't stand by and watch you burn your empire and your future to protect a little nurse that everyone already dismissed as worthless. It's too high a price for your heart. I saw the anger in his face flare intense and consuming, but then something shifted, something deep and profound, and the fury gave way to a terrible, breathtaking vulnerability, a raw exposure I hadn't seen since the first night the breaking of the boss. He started walking toward me, then slowly, deliberately, his eyes burning with an emotion I couldn't comprehend, something fierce and protective that went beyond lust or simple attraction. It was something foundational, the need to protect a last connection to humanity, a desperate final stand. He stopped right in front of me, water dripping from his chin, and he lifted a large, surprisingly gentle hand to cup the side of my face, his thumb tracing the outline of the dagger scar on my neck with a reverence I didn't deserve. "Then let the world know," he stated, his voice barely a whisper, yet holding more power than any shout I'd ever heard, silencing the storm around us, making the rain feel insignificant. "Let them call me weak. Let them call me a fool for choosing a woman who walked out of Markov's hell and brought his wrath with her. I have lost everything important to me once, Arya. My sister, my best friend. I won't lose you too, not for their respect, not for this rotten empire, not for any price. I refuse to repeat the past." And then in a move that was entirely uncalculated and intensely real, a desperate, raw act of passion, he pulled me into a fierce, desperate embrace, lifting me off the concrete barrier and crushing me against his wet chest, the heavy scent of rain salt and old leather filling my senses. His arms were iron bands around me, and I felt the tremor of his internal war running through him, the battle between his calculated self and the man who needed me. "If loving you makes me weak," he growled into my wet hair, his voice thick with unadulterated passion and pain, a promise of total devotion and self-destruction. "I'll burn everything. I will watch it all turn to ashes. Just don't you dare leave me. Not now. Not ever. We will face Markov together, and if we fall as one." And in that moment, standing on the desolate docks, wrapped in the arms of a monster who was choosing me over his power, I realized that our connection wasn't built on fantasy or desperation, but on a mutual understanding of survival and a refusal to let the past repeat itself. The kiss that followed was rain salt and fire, sealing a pact that transcended the brutality of the world we inhabited, a fierce promise of partnership that meant we were now truly alone against the world. The moment of commitment, though incredibly powerful, didn't stop the war. It only defined the terms of it, hardening both our resolves with a new shared purpose. Cassian doubled down, focusing his entire organization on retrieving Elias, and he brought me into the fold, completely ignoring the snarls and protests of the remaining doubters and the cynics like Valentina, who could only watch in stunned silence. I was no longer an advisor. I was his equal, his partner in war, the only person he trusted absolutely to understand the enemy's mind, and he used my knowledge of Markov's methods to anticipate every twisted psychological move. We worked for days without sleep, mapping out the revised extraction plan, but I knew I couldn't just sit and wait while Elias suffered the weight of the severed finger, still haunting my dreams, a constant reminder of the failure I carried. The thought of Elias alone and suffering because of me was a constant, unbearable pressure, and I knew the only way to alleviate it was to take a risk, a final, dangerous gamble to find one last crucial piece of information that would guarantee the mission's success, something Cassian might overlook. I slipped out one morning using my old nurse's uniform and ID, the one thing they hadn't confiscated, a brilliant disguise in a world of suits, to blend into the city's early morning commute, heading to an old abandoned industrial site. I remembered Elias mentioning years ago a place he used to joke about being a perfect dead drop for a man who kept secrets. It was a foolish, reckless move, a blatant violation of Cassian's orders to stay put, but I had to do it. I couldn't live with myself if I waited, and he died paralyzed by my guilt. I found nothing at the site, just rust debris and the stale smell of decay, and the crushing disappointment made me sag with fatigue, the adrenaline draining out of me, leaving me vulnerable. But as I was turning to leave, resigning myself to the failure of my solo mission, a hulking black van skidded to a stop right behind me, blocking my only exit, and before I could even draw a breath, I was grabbed hooded and dragged inside. The last thing I heard before the heavy hood was pulled over my head was a chilling, familiar voice dripping with sickening amusement, a voice that had been the soundtrack to my worst nightmares. Well, well, the little nurse decided to come out and play right into my hands. Rourke will be so disappointed, but I'll make sure he enjoys the show. Ivan Markov had me. The humiliation, the fear, and the self-loathing were instant and total, a massive wave crashing over me. Cassian had chosen me, burned his bridge for me, and I had repaid him with capture, validating every single voice that called me his weakness and his fatal mistake. When the hood came off, I was in a vast, dark, concrete room, tied securely and painfully to a metal chair, and Markov was standing directly in front of me, a grotesque parody of a man, his face scarred, and his eyes gleaming with the pure, cold joy of sadistic control. He didn't hurt me physically right away. He knew the psychological wound would be far more effective, twisting the knife of my self-blame and my fear for Cassian. He just smiled, that terrible shark-like smile, and leaned in close, his breath foul and warm against my ear. "Cassian won't come for you," he whispered, his voice like grinding sand, trying to sow the final seeds of doubt. "He's a businessman. He'll cut his losses. He'll decide the fragile little girl isn't worth his entire organization collapsing into chaos. You're just another piece of trash, Arya, and soon you'll be his too." He set up a camera, a massive professional-grade thing, and then he started the broadcast, the little red light blinking on, signaling the beginning of my public execution, my final humiliating stage. It was chilling, the realization that this was being streamed live, that all of Cassian's enemies, all the people who mocked him, were watching this spectacle of my slow degradation, drinking in his failure through my pain. Markov addressed the camera directly, his voice ringing with theatrical malice, playing to his audience. "Come alone, Rourke, or collect her corpse. Send your nurse to me and I'll send you what's left of her piece by piece, starting with that dagger mark she cherishes, that little memory of me." The ultimatum was public, final, and devastating, a perfect, humiliating trap designed to break Cassian or force his surrender. I sat there bound and terrified, the lights of the camera blinding me, and for the first time since the docks, I truly believed him. I truly believed that Cassian, faced with the absolute public destruction of his life's work, would choose his empire and his future over the woman who had only brought him trouble. He was a mafia boss, after all. Logic would win out over love, and I couldn't blame him for making the sensible choice. I closed my eyes, resigning myself to the fate I had earned through my own rashness, accepting the role of the sacrificial lamb that would allow Cassian to fight another day and find Elias. It was the lowest point, the complete agonizing psychological breaking point, feeling utterly abandoned and ready to face the end, hoping only that it would be swift. Then, just as Markov was leaning in, preparing for his final gruesome theatrics, the lights in the warehouse flickered violently, a sudden sharp surge of power that Markov didn't anticipate disrupting his moment. A low, distant sound, like a single heavy object hitting the concrete, resonated from the darkness at the far end of the room, a sound that carried the promise of imminent, focused violence. Markov frowned annoyance, replacing his smug smile, and he started to spin around his gun, already raised in a practiced, fluid motion. But before he could fully turn and assess the threat, a figure emerged from the shadows, slow and deliberate, a man who looked like he had walked through fire and come back entirely reborn, shedding his previous life for something more pure and dangerous. Cassian. He was alone, just as Markov had demanded, but he wasn't unarmed, though he carried no modern weapon. He was holding something small that glinted wickedly in the dim light of the warehouse, the antique, wicked-looking dagger that Elias had gifted him years ago, the one Elias used to call the Shadow, a weapon of pure personal retribution. The warehouse fell into a profound, terrifying silence, broken only by the sound of Cassian's steady, rhythmic footsteps on the concrete floor, footsteps that sounded like the inexorable march of fate. He was a terrifying sight, Not a man walking to his death, but a man walking to a destiny he had chosen his face. A mask of absolute consuming resolve ready to trade his life for mine without hesitation. Let her go. Cassian stated, his voice calm, steady, and entirely devoid of inflection, a sound that carried the weight of inevitable death, chilling Markov to the core. Your fight is with me. It always has been, Ivan. Leave her out of it. Markov just laughed, a sound like glass breaking, and he adjusted his aim, shifting the gun from its defensive posture to point directly at Cassian's heart. A gentleman's death, Rourke. How quaint. I think I'll make you watch her die first after she tells you how much she regrets being your weakness and how pointless your grand gesture was. That was the moment. The split second when Markov's focus shifted completely to Cassian, that brief, catastrophic lapse in his control over me. I wasn't thinking. I was reacting, propelled by the raw, animalistic instinct Markov's prison had cultivated in me, the sudden desperate refusal to be a burden or a victim one more second. With a guttural cry of pure, desperate adrenaline, I lunged forward, throwing my entire weight and the heavy metal chair I was tied to straight at Markov's knees. The surprise, the sheer violence of the desperate action from his supposedly helpless victim threw him completely off balance. The chair's legs tangled with his, and he stumbled, his shot going wide, smashing harmlessly into the concrete wall with a loud crack that signaled the beginning of the end of his reign. That single, desperate, reckless act created the opening Cassian needed, the small window of time that meant the difference between life and death. He didn't hesitate for a microsecond. With a speed that defied his size, he lunged across the distance, covering the few meters in a blur, the dagger held low and steady. Markov was still stumbling, trying to regain his footing, his eyes wide with shock and fury, but it was too late. Cassian slammed into him, driving the point of the dagger deep into his torso, with a sickening crunch. Markov screamed a terrible, inhuman sound of pure agony, and even as he was falling, already dying, he managed to raise his pistol, a wild final act of futile vengeance. I saw the muzzle flash the terrifying orange spark in the darkness, and I knew with sickening certainty that Cassian had been hit. But in that instant, I also realized that my hands, though still tied behind my back, had come loose from the chair in the lunge, and my mind, trained by years of quiet observation, had already registered the presence of a discarded pistol on a nearby wooden crate dropped by one of the guards who had abducted me. I scrambled, turning my back to the crate, feeling blindly with my bound hands locating the cold metal grip and pulling the trigger with a trembling, absolute resolve that transcended fear, a final, necessary action. Bang! The sound was deafening, the recoil tearing at my shoulder, and Markov's body, already collapsing from Cassian's blow, slumped heavily to the floor, the pistol falling from his lifeless hand. The silence that followed was total, final, and absolute, confirming that the monster was finally dead by both our hands. Cassian was breathing heavily, a dark, growing stain blooming on his shoulder, where Markov's wild shot had grazed him, but he was alive, his eyes fixed on me with a profound, stunned reverence. He staggered over to me, kicking Markov's gun away into the dust, and cut the last of the restraints from my wrists with a quick, practiced movement of the dagger, his hands surprisingly steady despite the wound. My hands were free, but I felt utterly weak, trembling violently, the full weight of what I had just done, the life I had just taken, crashing down on me, the final psychological barrier dissolving in the face of survival. He didn't say a word, just pulled me into his arms, the blood from his shoulder mixing with the dust and sweat on my clothes, and held me tightly, his heart beating a frantic, powerful rhythm against my ear, the sound a promise of life. Then he whispered the sound, raw and thick, echoing the very first command he'd ever given me, but the meaning completely reversed, filled now with love and commitment. "Sit," he muttered, rocking me gently, his voice thick with possessive relief, accepting me fully. "You're not leaving me. Not now. Not ever. We are one in this fight, and we just won." And I knew in the profound, terrible silence of that concrete room, surrounded by the wreckage of our war, that I was no longer the fragile girl who needed saving. I was his equal, his partner in survival, the woman who had helped him kill his demon, and the quiet dignity I had fought so hard to maintain had finally been recognized not through soft words or pity, but through fire and blood forever bonding us in a shared terrifying strength. The underworld could only whisper about it, the shocking truth of the confrontation spreading like a shockwave. Aria Lane, the overlooked quiet night shift nurse, the pathetic girl they had all laughed at and dismissed as dead weight, was the one who had finally ended Ivan Markov. The man they feared the most was brought down not by Cassian's army, but by her unexpected desperate act of defiance and a single resolute shot fired by a woman who refused to be a victim anymore. The shame and mockery that had been aimed at Cassian for choosing me dissolved instantly, replaced by a cold, abiding fear and a grudging respect for the woman he had chosen. The world corrects itself, you see, not with vengeance, but with consequences. The people who had laughed at me, who had wanted to dispose of me, faced the quiet, undeniable fallout of their arrogance, their positions within the Rourke organization, now precarious, their judgments exposed as dangerously incorrect. I didn't gloat. I didn't even acknowledge their existence. I just moved forward, standing at Cassian's side, my strength now undeniable, forged in the crucible of his war and my own survival. A few weeks later, when Cassian finally stood before the council, the room where Valentina had sneered at me, and where men had demanded I be disposed of, he confirmed the new reality. He didn't waste words looking out over the assembled silent faces, his eyes finding mine a private possessive acknowledgement of our truth. "She's not my weakness," he declared, his voice steady and low, but ringing with absolute authority, the final word on the matter that silenced all opposition, cementing my place. "She's my reason for fighting. She is my strength." And as I stood there, no longer a piece of dirt on the floor, but the recognized force beside the king, I realized that the quiet dignity I had always carried, the resilience I had refused to surrender, had finally found its true home, validated by the fire I walked through. My struggle was over, not because I was saved by a man, but because I finally saved myself, and in doing so, I saved him too. You know, sometimes you have to be completely broken before you can truly see the quiet, unbreakable strength you always carried inside. And sometimes the monster you run from is the only one who sees the hero you were meant to be, the one who never doubts your capacity for survival. I was underestimated, but I was never small. I was overlooked, but I was always whole. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.